May 1945. A continent erupts in celebration. In London, Paris, and Moscow, a tidal wave of relief washes over streets that for 6 long years had known only blackout and fear. The 1,000-year Reich has fallen, its cities turned to ash, its armies to dust. For millions, the war is over. But on a forgotten railway siding in the heart of a shattered Germany, there is no celebration. Here, another chapter is just beginning. Packed into the suffocating darkness of cattle cars are hundreds of young women. Their gray-green uniforms, the insignia of the 𝐏𝐿𝐴, the female auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht, are stained with the grime of a month-long retreat. They are secretaries, telephone operators, searchlight crews, the forgotten gears of a war machine that has ground to a halt. They had been promised glory. They had been told the enemy was a barbarian, a monster waiting at the gates. Propaganda posters had shown them snarling beasts in American uniforms. Their officers, in the final frantic days, had warned them. Captivity would be a fate worse than death. Now, as the train lurches forward, pulled westward into the unknown, every rattle of the wheels sounds like a countdown to the horrors they've been taught to expect. One girl, a radio operator from Dresden, clutches a worn photograph of her family. She is barely 19. In her mind, the warnings echo. Degradation, humiliation, revenge. The enemy would make an example of them. They had to. This is not a story of combat. It is not a story of generals and grand strategies. It is the story of a war after the war. A psychological battle fought not with bullets, but with something far more disorienting. It is the story of what happened when these women, braced for the enemy's hatred, collided with the most unexpected and powerful weapon of all: American abundance. The journey west was a funeral procession through a dead land. Through the cracks in the boxcar walls, the women saw their country in its death throes. Cities they once knew as beacons of culture were now jagged teeth on the horizon, skeletal ruins clawing at a smoke-choked sky. Cologne, Hamburg, Berlin, each a tombstone marking the grave of the Reich. There were no people in the streets, only ghosts, gaunt figures picking through rubble, their movements slow and lifeless. The train didn't stop for them. It rumbled on, an iron serpent carrying its cargo of condemned souls deeper into enemy territory. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and unwashed bodies. They shared scraps of stale bread, their last rations from a collapsing army. They whispered in the dark, old certainties crumbling with every mile. What would the Americans do? The stories they had been fed were a litany of terrors. They were the architects of the fire bombings, the heartless destroyers of their homes. A woman who had manned an anti-aircraft battery near Leipzig, her face hardened beyond her 22 years, stared into the darkness, her jaw set. "Let them try," she muttered, to no one in particular. It was a hollow bravado, a final shield against a terror too profound to voice. Days bled into a sleepless twilight. The train would stop, then start, its destination a mystery. Finally, it shrieked to a halt, not in a desolate camp, but amidst the chaotic symphony of a major port. Bremen. The doors were thrown open, and blinding daylight flooded the car. The women stumbled out, shielding their eyes. Before them was the Atlantic Ocean, vast and gray, and ships, dozens of them flying the American flag. The expected brutality never came. Instead, they were met with a baffling, almost inhuman, efficiency. American soldiers, their faces impassive, directed them with hand gestures and clipped English commands. There were no shouts, no blows. They were herded into lines, given tags, their names recorded on clipboards. It was the cold logic of bureaucracy. This wasn't the behavior of vengeful monsters. It was the work of administrators processing inventory. And in a way, that was even more terrifying. It stripped them of their identity, reducing them to a number, a piece of cargo to be shipped across the sea. As they were marched up the gangplank, a cold ocean wind whipping at their worn skirts, they stared at the soldiers lining the rails. The Americans stared back, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, boredom, and a weary professionalism. These were the faces of the enemy, young, tired, ordinary. They looked less like the demonic figures from the propaganda films and more like the boys who had lived down the street in a world before the war. This first contradiction was a silent crack in the foundation of their hatred. The ship's horn blared, a deep, mournful sound that severed their last tie to Europe. As the coastline of Germany dissolved into the mist, a profound sense of isolation descended. They were now utterly at the mercy of their captors, adrift on an endless ocean, headed for a mythical land. A land they had been taught was a nation of gangsters and degenerates, yet one that had crushed their invincible Reich from half a world away. They were sailing into the heart of the beast. The voyage across the Atlantic became a new kind of prison. The women were housed deep within the ship's hull, in cavernous steel holds filled with stacked bunks. The air was a cocktail of diesel fumes, salt, and the ever-present stench of seasickness. For days they were tossed by the rhythm of the ocean, their world reduced to the groaning of metal and the shadowy figures of their fellow prisoners. But it was here, in the iron belly of the ship, that the first true assault on their reality began. Twice a day, guards would bring them food on metal trays. The first time, the women stared in disbelief. It wasn't the watery turnip soup or the ersatz bread made from sawdust they had survived on for the last year. On the trays were slabs of meat, boiled potatoes, and thick slices of pale, soft bread. And with it, mugs of steaming black coffee, its aroma so rich it felt like a memory from another life. Suspicion was the immediate reaction. Was it poisoned? Was this a cruel trick? A final fattening before the slaughter? A few refused to eat. Others, driven by a gnawing hunger that had become their constant companion, devoured the food with a desperate, almost shameful urgency. Tears streamed down their faces, tears of relief, of confusion. A former typist from Munich whispered to her bunkmate, her voice choked with emotion, "They are feeding us their food." It was an act that defied all logic. Their own leaders, in the final days, had left them to starve while they feasted in bunkers. The Reich had demanded their absolute loyalty, and in return had given them empty promises and emptier stomachs. Now, the enemy, the sworn enemy, was giving them sustenance. This simple act of providing a meal did more to undermine their ideology than 1,000 pamphlets. It didn't feel like kindness. It felt like a display of power, a quiet, confident statement that said, "We have so much. We can afford to feed our captives better than your own leaders fed you." When the coast of America finally appeared on the horizon, it was like a vision from a dream. The women crowded the decks, their faces a mixture of awe and dread. They sailed past a colossal statue of a woman holding a torch, an icon of liberty that felt like a bitter joke. Beyond it, a skyline of impossible towers rose into the sky, gleaming and whole. Not a single building was scarred by bombs. Not a single wisp of smoke stained the air. New York City. The sight was a physical blow. They had been told American cities were decadent and weak. They had seen what Allied bombers had done to their own. To see this vibrant, untouched, thriving metropolis, was to finally and completely understand the scale of their defeat. Germany was a graveyard. America hadn't even been wounded. As they were marched ashore, onto the soil of this strange new world, the air itself felt different. It was clean, filled with the scent of salt and gasoline, untainted by the lingering stench of death and decay that had become the perfume of their homeland. Crowds of Americans lined the docks to watch them pass. There were some jeers, some hostile glares, but mostly just stares. They were a curiosity, a parade of vanquished foes. From the docks, they were loaded onto buses with barred windows, and then onto trains. The journey into the American interior began. For hours, they stared out the windows at a landscape that defied belief. They passed through neat towns with white picket fences, where children played on manicured lawns and bright-colored cars drove down paved streets. They saw endless fields of corn and wheat, farms with sturdy red barns, and factories that pulsed with productivity, not fire. The sheer, unapologetic prosperity of the country was overwhelming. It was a universe away from the rubble-strewn nightmare they had left behind. A silent, unnerving question began to form in their minds. They had been told they were fighting to save the world from a corrupt and degenerate enemy. But looking out the window, it was clear who had been living in a collapsing world, and who had not. The propaganda was beginning to look like a pathetic lie. As the train carried them deeper into the country, towards camps with names like Fort Oglethorpe and Camp Ruston, their initial fear of American cruelty began to morph into a new, more unsettling dread, the fear of American truth. The gates of the prisoner of war camp closed behind them, and for a moment, the old fears resurfaced. Barbed wire coiled atop the fences. Guard towers stood like silent sentinels at each corner. But again, the reality was jarringly different from their imagination. This was no concentration's lager. The barracks were wooden but well-constructed, laid out in neat rows. The grounds were clean. The guards moved with a relaxed authority, not the snarling aggression of their own SS. After another round of bureaucratic processing, they were led towards a long, low building from which steam was billowing. This, they thought, must be it. The moment of humiliation. The stories from the Eastern Front of disinfection and degradation flashed through their minds. They braced themselves for the worst. Inside, the room was tiled and filled with the hiss of pipes. They were ordered to undress, their worn uniforms taken away. They stood, vulnerable and trembling, awaiting the next order. And then it was given. An American guard, a burly sergeant with a surprisingly gentle voice, began handing each woman 2 items. The first was a clean, folded towel. The second was a bar of soap. They stared at the objects in their hands as if they were alien artifacts. The soap wasn't the harsh, gritty lye soap of wartime Germany. It was smooth, white, and fragrant. It smelled faintly of flowers. It was a luxury beyond comprehension. Then the guards pointed them towards the showers. As they stepped under the nozzles, they flinched, expecting ice-cold water. Instead, streams of steaming hot water poured down, washing away weeks of filth and fear. In that moment, the psychological defenses of many of the women shattered. Some began to weep openly, their sobs echoing off the tiled walls. The feeling of being truly clean for the first time in months or even years was a sensation so powerful it was physically overwhelming. It was an act of profound, undeniable humanity. But it was also a strategic masterstroke. Whether intentional or not, it was impossible to cling to the image of a soulless monster when that monster had just given you the simple, profound dignity of a hot shower and a bar of fragrant soap. One woman, Anna, a former secretary who kept a hidden diary, would later write that night, "We were promised pain. We were given soap. I do not know which is harder to bear." The disorientation continued in the mess hall. The room was filled with the overwhelming aroma of roasting meat, fresh-baked bread, and brewing coffee. The women were filed past a serving line where cooks in white aprons piled their trays high with beef stew, vegetables, and buttered rolls. The sheer quantity of the food was shocking. The quality was unthinkable. They sat at long wooden tables, eating in a stunned, reverent silence. This wasn't prison food. This was a feast. The shame was a palpable force. Every bite was a reminder of their starving families back home. Letters, when they managed to get through the censors, painted a grim picture of life in occupied Germany. Mothers boiling weeds for soup. Children with the distended bellies of malnutrition. Here, in an enemy camp, they were gaining weight. Their skin, once sallow, regained its color. Their hair, once brittle, grew healthy. This contrast was a form of psychological torture more potent than any physical abuse. Life settled into a strange rhythm. They were woken by a bell, worked light duties in the camp laundry or on nearby farms, and were paid for their labor in camp scrip. With this currency, they could visit the post exchange, or PX, a small store inside the camp that represented the pinnacle of their bewilderment. On its shelves were items that had vanished from German life years ago. Bars of Hershey's chocolate, cartons of Lucky Strike cigarettes, tubes of bright red lipstick, even nylon stockings. For women who had been taught that American capitalism was a corrupt failure, this small shop was a temple of enemy success. To buy a chocolate bar was a moment of intense, guilt-ridden pleasure. To apply lipstick was a radical act of reclaiming a femininity that the war had tried to erase. One girl from Hamburg stared at her reflection, her lips a vibrant red, and whispered, "I feel like a woman again. Not a soldier, but with every small comfort." The invisible walls of their ideology cracked a little more. They had been loyal to a regime that had led them to ruin. They were prisoners of a nation that, for reasons they could not fathom, treated them with a detached, bureaucratic decency. It forced a terrible question into the forefront of their minds. Who was the real enemy? The one who demanded your sacrifice and let you starve? Or the one who captured you and then gave you soap, chocolate, and a wage? The answer was too terrifying to confront, but impossible to ignore. As the weeks turned into months, the initial shock of arrival began to fade, replaced by the slow, grinding reality of life as a prisoner. The routine of the camp was monotonous, but it was a safe monotony. The fear of bombs and artillery was gone, replaced by the dull ache of homesickness and the sharp sting of guilt. This guilt was stoked by the irregular arrival of letters from home. Each one was a portrait of despair. A mother's letter to her daughter read, "The house is gone. We live in the cellar with 3 other families. Your little brother asks for you. He is so thin, he does not remember what bread without sawdust tastes like." After reading such a letter, the hearty meal in the mess hall would taste like ashes. The comfort of a clean bunk felt like a betrayal. The women were caught in a painful paradox. Their survival felt like a sin. Some clung to their old beliefs with a fierce desperation. They whispered in the barracks at night, searching for proof that the Americans' decency was a facade. The food must be drugged to make them docile. The work was a plan to exploit them. It was a trick, and they had to be vigilant. But as day followed uneventful day, the conspiracy theories became harder to sustain. The only cruelty was the quiet, relentless routine and the ever-present barbed wire. The Americans themselves remained a puzzle. The guards were a cross-section of the nation. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, clerks from New York. Most were professional, keeping a careful distance. They were following the rules of the Geneva Convention, regulations that the Nazi regime had treated with contempt. This adherence to a code of conduct, even for a hated enemy, was another source of confusion for the prisoners. Yet small, unsanctioned moments of humanity occasionally breached the divide. A young guard, seeing a prisoner struggling to lift a crate in the laundry, might quietly help her without a word. Another might share a cigarette through the fence. During outdoor work details, a soldier might hum a popular Glenn Miller tune and be shocked when one of the German women quietly hummed along, the melody a fragile bridge across a chasm of war. These moments were rare, but they were powerful. They chipped away at the monolithic caricature of the Ami enemy, revealing him to be just a man, subject to boredom, fatigue, and occasional empathy. The most profound revelations, however, came when the women were taken on work details outside the camp. Loaded onto the backs of trucks, they were driven into nearby American towns. It was one thing to see the nation's prosperity from a train window. It was another to be immersed in it. They worked in fields alongside American civilians, or in canneries, packing fruits and vegetables. They saw main streets bustling with shoppers, drugstores with glowing neon signs, movie theaters advertising Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. They saw a nation completely untouched by the physical devastation of war. A nation where life, for the most part, simply went on. This was, perhaps, the cruelest discovery of all. Their entire world had been consumed by the war. Their sacrifices, their losses, their suffering, it had all been for a cause that had ended in total ruin. For America, the war was something that happened over there. Here, it was a distant headline, a telegram delivered to a neighbor's house. The sheer indifference of American daily life was a testament to a power so vast it was incomprehensible. One afternoon, a group working in a municipal park was given a break. The guards allowed them to sit on the grass. Nearby, a group of American children were playing baseball. Their laughter carried on the breeze. The women watched in silence. The sight of healthy, carefree children playing in the sun was an image of such profound peace, it was almost violent in its contrast to their memories of starving, terrified children huddled in Berlin bomb shelters. That night, the mood in the barracks was somber. The day's experience had stripped away the last vestiges of denial. Germany had not just lost the war, it had lost reality itself. The world of prosperity, peace, and progress that their leaders had promised them. It already existed, right here, in the land of their enemy. They had been fighting to destroy a paradise in order to build a ruin. Anna wrote in her diary, her handwriting tight and angry. "Today I saw children play. They did not look over their shoulders for planes. They were not hungry. We were told we were the master race, destined to rule a world we would build from scratch. The world is already built, and we are its prisoners. The war of ideas was over. The propaganda had been exposed as a hollow, pathetic lie. Not by counter-propaganda, but by the simple, overwhelming evidence of a Hershey bar, a hot shower, and a child's carefree laughter. The fortress of hatred had been breached, and inside there was only a vast empty space where belief used to be. As autumn gave way to the first chill of winter, a new anxiety began to creep through the camp. Rumors began to circulate, whispers of repatriation, of lists being drawn up, of eastbound ships being prepared. The war in Europe was long over, and the time was coming to send the prisoners home. A year earlier, the prospect of going home would have been a cause for joyous celebration. Now it was a source of profound dread. Home was no longer a place of comfort and safety. Home was a landscape of ruins, a world of starvation, shame, and judgment. They had seen pictures in newspapers the guards left behind. Horrifying images of skeletal figures in liberated concentration camps, of German civilians being forced to confront the atrocities committed in their name. And they feared the judgment of their own families. How could they explain their experience? How could they describe their clean clothes and healthy bodies to a mother who was boiling shoe leather for soup? Their survival, once a miracle, now felt like a mark of Cain. They had been spared the final agonizing collapse of their country, and they feared they would be resented for it. A new, treasonous thought took root and was whispered in the darkest hours of the night. I don't want to go back. To remain a prisoner in abundant America felt safer than being set free into the desolation of Germany. The final bitter irony of their situation had become clear. They had been captured by the enemy, only to find that the true prison was the homeland they had fought for. One frosty morning, the announcement came. The women were assembled in the camp yard. An American officer stood before them and began to read from a list of names. These were the first to be repatriated. A heavy silence fell over the crowd. This was not the joyous news of release. It felt like a sentence. As her name was called, Anna stepped forward. Her body had healed in America, but her spirit felt broken in a way she couldn't explain. She had arrived terrified of what the enemy would do to her. She was leaving terrified of what she had become. The simple certainties of her world, friend and foe, right and wrong, love of country, had all been dissolved by the slow, relentless acid of American decency. As she and the others were loaded onto the trucks that would begin their long journey home, she took one last look at the camp, the orderly barracks, the guard towers, the barbed wire. It had been her prison, but in a strange and unsettling way, it had also been her sanctuary. She and the hundreds of women like her were not just being sent back to Germany. They were being sent back as unwilling witnesses to a truth their country was not ready to hear. The enemy was not a monster. The Reich was not a glorious empire. Their sacrifice had been for nothing more than a madman's dream. They were leaving the gilded cage of their captivity, not as conquered soldiers, but as something far more dangerous to the myths of the past. They were survivors who now knew the truth. Their war was finally over, but their struggle was just beginning.